Hey comic book fans, so about 2 years ago, right around the time that Superman and Lois was ready to hit CW, I started watching a different Superman show at the same time as Superman and Lois, obviously, Smallville. I had always heard about Smallville a lot growing up, but I never watched it. I was more of an animated superhero TV show type of person, like Batman animated series or Justice League or Spider-Man. And I had some friends that watched Smallville, but I just never bothered. I was like, okay, you know what? Since at the time we were deprived of Superman related content, let me go through and watch all of Smallville. And I had heard going into it, the rumor was always Smallville's 10 seasons. The first 5 are outstanding and the last 5 are kind of like Dexter. I could not disagree with that anymore. I think the entire show of Smallville is really, really good. Not consistent, but good. I don't think there's like this clear delineation between good season and bad season like halfway through and it all just goes off the rails. So I thought, now that I've watched all 217 episodes of Smallville, as someone who came to it much later in life and about 10 years after the show completed its initial run, what are my thoughts? Does the show hold up? And where does it stand in Superman history? Because I'm a huge Superman fan. So before we go into the show itself, I think it's really important that we talk about some context, because so often the conversation around Smallville revolves around or perceives it through the lens of modern superhero storytelling, and I don't think you can really do that when you're approaching Smallville. So the show originally aired in October of 2001, and the world of superhero movies was drastically different at that point. We only just recently had Bryan Singer's X-Men, the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man. We didn't have Batman Begins or The Dark Knight. Heck, we didn't even have Brandon Routh's Superman. The last Superman we got was Superman for the Quest for Peace, and I think that was either like the 80s or early 90s, and it was a movie that was made, and should it have been? Probably not. Having a superhero origin TV show was kind of an unknown concept in the early 2000s, especially when, at that point in time, superheroes were not overly popular like they are today. The comic book genre was still kind of recovering from the debacle that was Batman and Robin, so we kind of have to ease our way into the superhero lore. That's why the earlier seasons of Smallville play it more just like a drama of a superpowered being as opposed to an actual superhero show, just because I think there was some trepidation around comic book lore. I think they were like, well, we don't want a repeat of Batman and Robin. Even the first Bryan Singer X-Men movie kind of shied away from more comic booky elements.
You actually go outside in these things?
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
And so I get why Smallville might want to play it straight at first, but eventually they do kind of lean more into the comic book material, and that'll take me to some of my positives. I think some of the best parts of the show are when they decide to lean into the comic book material, because they are fully aware of some of the cheesier and cornier bits of Superman lore, and when they want to be, they're not afraid to lean into that. Granted, do they always pull it off perfectly? No. But no superhero show does. As great as Arrow and The Flash might be, there's dumb stuff that happens there too. Gotham gets real weird at times. Any superhero show is going to have a lot of good and a lot of bad. I think when they chose to embrace their comic book materials throughout the show, I think it was at its strongest, but also I think it was at its strongest when you got good character interactions. The show, for the most part, was incredibly well cast, and I think one of the big highlights for that, not my overall my biggest highlight for the show, but one of the biggest highlights for me was always Michael Rosenbaum as Lex. I thought he is still to this day the definitive Lex Luthor, but then again, looking around, he doesn't have much competition. Jesse Eisenberg, not great. He was awful in Batman vs. Superman. But even then, this might be blasphemous in some corners of the comic book universe, but I thought Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor also sucked. I thought he was terrible. Whereas Michael Rosenbaum's Lex, he has this cold calculating menace, but at the same time, like Clark, you kind of hold out hope that maybe he's good this time. Maybe we can trust him because he's just this versatile actor that you want to believe him. You want to like him. He's a good dude. But in reality, no, he's still Lex Luthor, and you know what Lex Luthor is. But there's still that interesting dichotomy of, is it his environment? Could Clark have saved him if he was a better friend to Lex? Or was Lex always going to go down the path that he was destined to be because he's Lex freaking Luthor? If he had a Jonathan Kent type of figure in his life, would Lex have still turned? Which, that's my next positive. John Schneider as Jonathan Kent is, to me, one of the greatest castings of all time. I think he is definitively the best Jonathan Kent we've ever gotten. I firmly believe that he is Clark's father in this. The dichotomy that he and Clark have is so beautiful. It feels like an actual genuine father-son relationship of, yes, he's got these great moments where he's proud of Clark and his accomplishments. At the same time, he can come across as a little cold because he's being overly protective of Clark, but not ever in a mean, condescending way. If it's a, you understand him. I buy him as this hard-working, blue-collar type dad that just wants to do the best to protect his family, protect his farm, protect his living. I just love John Schneider's Jonathan Kent. I think it was easily the best casting of the entire show. Another brilliant piece of casting for Smallville, which happened in the later season, I believe in season 4, was the introduction of Erica Durance as Lois Lane. So I'll talk about him more in a little bit here, but Tom Welling at times was a bit of a stiff actor, except in scenes where he's with Erica Durance as Lois Lane. For some reason, from the get-go, he comes across so much more natural, his shoulders relax, he's a much more likable character to be around when he's playing off of her. And that's the case with a lot of other characters. Her Lois Lane, I think, brings out the best in other characters around her. She kind of has the same effect as Robin in Stranger Things. Of any scene that I see Robin with other characters, those other characters somehow have better chemistry with each other when Robin is thrown into the occasion. And it's the same thing with Erica Durance's Lois Lane. I think she's a great adaptation of Lois, the character of, yeah, at times she needs to be saved by Clark, but she saves Clark just as much. They are a good, cohesive team by the end of their arc. Yeah, they've got their typical CW squabbling. You kind of expect that at this point. It's a CW show. It's gonna have some of that romantic drama, whether you want it or not. I think the romantic tension storylines got a lot better when she was there, as opposed to, no offense to Lana, but Lana was never my favorite character on Smallville. I think we'll talk about more later, but she overstayed her welcome. Whereas Lois, she just makes everyone else in the scene better, but specifically Clark. I think Tom Welling, as an actor, loosened up a little bit more, had more fun when Lois was around, and that's essentially what the Lois character should be. Someone that's there to support, but also help Clark in his journey to become who we know he will be. Which, lastly for me, in terms of positives, the best positive and the biggest praise I can say is the journey and the arc that Tom Welling goes through as both an actor and a director for Smallville. So when my wife and I started watching Smallville, we would frequently make fun of Tom Welling in the earlier seasons because Plank from Ed and Nettie had more emotional range, I think, in those early days. He just seemed stiff, he seemed awkward. Whether that was him conveying an awkward teenager, I'm not entirely convinced. I just think he was a little wooden and awkward, to the point of just going, really? This is our Superman someday. But through the course of all 10 seasons, by the time we get to Clark at the end of the show, I'm going, not only has Clark undergone a journey, but Tom Welling as a performer, I believe, has undergone a journey, because there's much more facets to the character when we get to the final season of he is serious when he needs to be, he's goofy and dorky when he needs to be. Tom Welling, plays goofy and dorky, bumbling Clark Kent a whole heck of a lot better than I thought he ever could. When he is not taking himself seriously, he's a great performer. And I said at the beginning, his arc for being an actor and a director, quite often in the later seasons, Tom Welling would direct certain episodes, and that would end up being some of my favorite episodes of that season. For someone that was notoriously no flights, no tights, I don't want to fly or be in the Superman suit at all in the show, there were certain episodes that he would fully embrace the comic bookness. Booster, an episode we'll talk about later, is very steeped in comic book lore and logic, and I loved every second of it. It made me go, well, why couldn't we get this the whole time? I think he had such an interesting visual flair as a director. Some directors on Smallville made very weird and deliberate choices to be like, I'm stylized and unique. Tom's always felt like, okay, I want to have my own unique stamp, but at the same time still make it feel like I'm in the Smallville bubble. I'm not trying to make a Tom Welling mini episode on someone else's show. He's making it unique, but doesn't make it so much of all about himself from a directorial standpoint. I really liked the episodes that he did. He very much surprised me as a director. But like I said, over the 10 seasons, I know the show is about Clark's journey, but just as Clark grew up, I think Tom Welling grew up as a performer, and it was really, really fascinating to see, like, compare the last episode to the first episode. You're going, oh wow, this was really, really cool to see. But with 10 seasons of a TV show, it ain't all pretty. Let's be honest. There's definitely some wonkier aspects to Smallville. To me, one of the biggest negatives of Smallville is anytime they have a villain that does not have the last name of Luthor. Lex and Lionel were fantastic foils for the first half of the series. And then in the tail half, you get really, really, really weird Doomsday, which I pretend they didn't do, but it happened. And I know some people really liked Callum Blue as Zod, and I think vocally and mannerism-wise, he is spot on to Terrence Stamp's Zod, but I never really understood Zod's mission or his point. He just seemed like a vaguely evil character. He wasn't necessarily that interesting to me. And I think that might be just because Michael Rosenbaum had such a high bar for Lex. He was just so high up there, and Lionel Luthor was such a good foil for Lex. And then when Lionel eventually turned face, he was an interesting character. Their dichotomy was a good, like, background narrative to whatever Clark was going on in his own, like, A plot. You had the Luthor B plot, and sometimes they intersect. It was really, really well done. But anytime the Luthors weren't there, it doesn't always connect for me. And I get Michael Rosenbaum wanted some time away from the show. He left after season 7, and we get Tess. I always felt bad for Cassidy Freeman, who played Tess, just because I feel like she was asked to be a Lex, but wasn't necessarily that character. Like, she was put in a really tough spot of, a lot of these actors have already been on the show for 7 years, so you get to come in for the last 3 and try and make things your own. Her character doesn't really work for me, but I don't blame her for that. It was just, I don't know if they knew what they were doing post Lex, if that makes sense. Another negative is something that I kind of briefly touched about earlier, but Lana was never one of my favorite characters, and she just grew to be even worse and worse as the show dragged on, because I think one of the biggest negatives was they held on to Lana Lang for way too long. I think once Clark graduates from high school, that's when you cut it off with Lana. Have him move to Metropolis full-time after high school, cut out Lana. Lana stayed for like a season or 2 longer than she really should have, and it showed because they kind of ran out of storylines to write for her, and we take some weird directions, which is kind of another negative that I've got, is Smallville has some weird storylines, like really weird, especially with Lana. Hey, when you're in France, you want to join this weird cult? Like we'll give you like this tattoo, and we'll make you like a witch or whatever. It was just the weirdest storyline. And then you get, like, in the final season, you get Chloe kind of going off with Checkmate for a little bit, and it's never really explained why or given a good enough reason why she just disappears. Things just happen. Like, Brainiac is there for a bit and then just poof, and then reappears for one of the best episodes of all time. They have some great storylines, and then they've got some ones that you're just going, you needed filler. All the Smallville seasons to me kind of start off really good and end really well, but there's stuff in the middle, and I think that's when I come around to, I don't miss those 22 episode seasons anymore. I'm one of those people that I think 15 episodes per season, if they're all tight and drive the narrative forward, that's a much better option than 22 episodes, but only half of them are actually necessary, if that makes sense. Another negative, and this is maybe just a minor nitpick, is the costume design could be a bit spotty. Some things that Clark wore, like his final red leather jacket before he actually gets a suit in season 10, that was not bad. That was pretty cool. But let's not bring up some other members of the Justice League. Looking at you, Famous Shit Jackson Cyborg. Oh, you did my boy dirty. That has to be one of the laziest Party City costumes I have ever seen. Some costumes are pretty good. Oliver Queen's Green Arrow looks great, minus the missing goatee. No, I'm still not over that. Green Arrow should always have a Robin Hood goatee. Yes, always. I will give a pass to Blue Beetle in season 10, just because I don't think they had the budget for it, but I can see why some people would make fun of it. I completely get it. I think the costumes could be a bit better. I'll give them somewhat of a pass just because of budgetary constraints, but yeah, don't think the costumes were as good as they could have been. They were a little inconsistent, if you will. And that brings me to, I think, the biggest weakness of all of Smallville was just its inconsistency. You could go from one of the best episodes of television to, honestly, an episode that just makes you question why you're still watching the show. And that's just Smallville in a nutshell. You can have a fantastic, emotionally heavy, emotionally enriching episode, and then you get one where Clark fights a bug man, or a really, really just romance, sappy CW heavy episode. It was so inconsistent that it was frustrating at times, but it was like, sit through the bad, and eventually you'll get a really, really good episode. You just don't know when it's going to be. There's some weird stuff. I just wish it was a little more consistent. When Smallville hits, it hits really well. But when it misses, it takes some weird turns. So with there being 217 episodes, I believe, give or take, I've already said it, so I'm going to stick with 217. With that many episodes, what are the best of the best? If you're like, Nathan, I'm not interested in seeing 200 plus episodes of Smallville. I get you. I understand completely. But you still want to watch certain episodes? Here's the ones that I would recommend. These are the ones that are like by far my favorite episodes of Smallville through the entire run. You get Legion, in which case Clark meets the Legion of superheroes from the future. I just really like it because I love when other comic book characters are allowed to be comic book characters and we embrace some of the cornier stuff. This episode was written by Jeff Johns back when that meant something and it wasn't a big controversial thing. I think he's a really good television writer when he wants to be, and you could tell that he clearly has a passion for these characters with the way that they're treated. It was just a fun reprieve that was so desperately needed in the middle of this really wonky Doomsday storyline. I like superhero crossover episodes, and I think the Legion is one of those you get a little bit of the superhero crossover, but you get one of my favorite aspects of Smallville, which is the teasing of things to come, or you will be great someday. You get a lot of that with Legion naturally. That's why they come to Clark for help. I just really like that episode. Next up, you get the 100th episode of Reckoning, and the big deal with this episode, it was the death of Jonathan Kent. And it doesn't make it any easier knowing what's going to happen in this episode. Like, I knew that Reckoning was the episode that he dies going into it. I hadn't seen the episode. I just knew that he was going to die. And it still sucks because, like I said earlier, Jonathan Kent is one of my favorite characters on the entire show. I think John Schneider was perfectly cast, and I still maintain that he's the best Jonathan Kent we've ever gotten. He was just so perfect. But it forces Clark into this next stage of life that was so desperately needed. He moved on. It just sucks that it had to happen, but for Superman reasons, you kind of have to. Although I wouldn't necessarily mind a Superman movie where both Jonathan and Martha are alive to see Superman, at least for a little bit. I don't know if James Gunn will go that route, but I would appreciate that. Next up, you have one that I love, good passing of the torch moments, and that's exactly what Rosetta is. So essentially, Clark is getting these signals and messages that he can't decipher. So he gets this mysterious email from one Virgil Swan. So he goes to meet this Virgil Swan, and who is it but Christopher frickin' Reeve, the OG Superman. I knew this was coming because it's a famous moment on the show, but it still got me so giddy of Superman meeting Superman. It just felt right because Virgil Swan was the entry point, or the start of the Kryptonian side of the Smallville storytelling. Up until this point, they're just like, yeah, you're an extraordinary being with superpowers. Virgil Swan and Christopher Reeve are the ones that say, no, you are from the planet Krypton. This is a planet that blew up, and it's just this nice, yeah, this makes sense. This is the passing of the torch, because at this point, we didn't have Brandon Routh as Superman in Superman Returns. We didn't have Henry Cavill for Man of Steel, although he was still trying out for Superman Returns, which is a crazy thing to think about. So this was essentially the last Superman talking to what will be the someday Superman, which I think is just such a super cool concept. I'm always kind of curious if the show had bigger plans for the Virgil Swan character had Christopher Reeve not unfortunately passed away in real life. And they had a beautiful tribute to him in one of the later episodes where he actually did pass away. I've always kind of wondered if they had a larger role for him had he still been alive, but in the limited role that we got him in, I think that was such a brilliant way to handle him while fully acknowledging the condition that he was in physically. They do not shy away from that, but that's just a part of who the character was. It was such a profound episode, and it really launched it into that next stage of Superman storytelling. Now, a lot of people might have this episode as like their favorite of all time, and I might had the whole episode been great, not just the last 5 to 10 minutes, and that is the series finale, part 1 and part 2. I think this finale is fantastic. I know some people are just like, it's not conclusive enough, or it's a little disappointing just because we never get to see Tom Welling in a suit. I get that to a certain extent, but that was never the point of the show. The point of the show was about Clark accepting his fate as Superman and accepting the responsibilities of what it means to be the beacon of light in the world. For me personally, I don't need to see him in the Superman suit or a practical one. It's a really wonky CG one. I just need the character to accept the call, so to speak, and he does that really, really well. I think everything gets tied up perfectly. It's the tease of the future, and then just the closing shot of the show as he's running towards the camera with the classic Christopher Reeve Superman music blasting as he rips open his shirt. Honestly, I can't think of a better way to end the series. It still makes me super excited every time I think about it, and it was a really well done finale. I think it was just everything the show had been building up to. By the time you get to the finale, it just feels epic and grand in scope, and I think it's incredibly well done. So this next episode was actually almost in consideration for my top spot, but I'm like, and the number 1 spot's not going to get knocked off anytime soon. And I don't see this one talked about in the upper echelon nearly as much, and that is the Tom Welling directed Booster, the introduction of Booster Gold and Jaime Reyes' Blue Beetle. I thought it was interesting that while they mentioned Ted Kord in the episode, they stick with Jaime Reyes, which I was totally fine with. And for a TV budget, I don't think Blue Beetle looks that bad. Not great, but not bad. I really, really enjoy this episode. It embraces the comic bookness. Booster Gold is wacky and ridiculous, as he should be. But we'll talk about more in like special moments that I loved, but this also fully embraces its comic bookness in a moment that I did not see coming, involving a phone booth, and I genuinely lost it more there than I did in the finale of the show. Another episode, a pair of episodes that really got to me, had nothing to do with Clark or Superman. It all had to do with a kid named Ryan. So for those that are familiar with Scrubs, Ryan is kind of like the Brendan Fraser from Scrubs of Smallville. They're only really in like 2 episodes, but boy do they leave an impact before ultimately, spoiler alert, dying of cancer in the most emotionally gut-wrenching way possible. So in Scrubs, Brendan Fraser just dies of cancer, and it's like this big rug pull. In Smallville, we meet Ryan in season 1, and he's this really endearing kid that's trying to run away from a bad situation. So Clark kind of becomes the older brother and mentors him. And we don't see him for a while, and then I believe we see him again in season 2. But these powers that he had that was first introduced in the first one, of he can kind of read people's minds, he has these powers, but they're deteriorating his brain and giving him a tumor in his head. And so he can keep using his powers, but he's gonna die. And so there's nothing Clark can do to save him. It's this lesson that any Superman has to learn at some point is you can't save everyone. And so Clark having to watch this small child die is so profoundly moving, and it's this kid that will always look up to him. He thought Clark was going to be the best hero of them all. Little does he know, or does he? But I think the moment that always gets to me in that episode is when Ryan has all these voices in his head, and so Clark takes him up in a hot air balloon, and so Ryan's like, I thought you were afraid of heights. Wink, wink, no flights, no tights, that reference again. But Clark says, not when I'm up here, not when I'm flying with you, to which I'm just going, they will never reference this again because they're not long-term storytellers like that. But I think it's just this cool mental note for me going forward of, well, when he does fly someday, he's going to be thinking of Ryan, the coolest character on Smallville, who taught him that you can't save everyone, but still save as many as you can. I love the Ryan episode so much, and gets me right here in a show that honestly is a little light on emotional weight at times. My second favorite episode, though, Absolute Justice, because superhero crossover with Hawkman and Dr. Fate and Stargirl, every Justice Society member. I love a bunch of random heroes thrown together like you just dumped out your toy box. It's so much fun. Embrace the cheesy campiness. Michael Shanks is a really, really good Hawkman. I really enjoyed his performance. I like the big crossovers, and I think it was really well written and really fun. But my favorite episode in the entire run of Smallville has to be from season 10, Homecoming, also known as Smallville Does a Christmas Story, because so Clark and Lois go back to their high school reunion, even though Lois was only at Smallville High for 2 weeks. She still claims that's the longest time she was ever at any high school. And so Brainiac reappears out of nowhere and whisks Clark away. We think it's going to be for nefarious reasons, but it's actually to show Clark important moments in his life of past, present, and future. So in the past, Clark is finally able to see that he was not responsible for his father's death, a storyline that had not been resolved for about 5 years, and Clark was still carrying the weight of the situation on his shoulders, thinking he was responsible. So with that weight lifted, he realized, oh, it wasn't my fault that someone I cared about died. So that burden gets removed from him. Then we cut back to the present day where he has abandoned Lois because Brainiac whisked him away, and we think someone's coming to threaten her because it's one of the bad guys from the very first episode of first season of Smallville, back when he was still in high school. He comes up to Lois and says, if you see Clark, tell him thanks. A lot of us here owe him our thanks. We were doing bad things back in the day, but he set us straight. Showing the influence and the power that Superman has for a positive force for good. And I thought that was such a beautiful touch, bringing back one of the original actors, and showing, yes, you can make a difference. And then the best part of the whole show, not gonna lie, is you've seen the past, you've seen the present, that means you get to see the future. And while you don't see him in the Superman costume, seeing him talk to his future self and seeing the bumbling yet confident person that he will become, the Superman, the Clark that we know and love, I just love it so much. And seeing him do the classic save Lois from a helicopter thing, that's a beautiful, excellent, well done scene. And then the cherry on top, because they missed prom, Clark dances with Lois, to which he starts floating and flying for the first time ever. Let's go! I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. It's so well done. You don't have him fly for 10 seasons, but it's these little intimate moments with Lois that get him to fly for the first time, whether he realizes it or not. When they want to, Smallville has beautiful storytelling. It's just inconsistent. Now, lastly, just some random things that I liked from Smallville. Just random moments and one-offs, things that are good. Random little detail, after he fights Doomsday, and Doomsday is more or less banished to the center of the earth, which is, where he'll eventually come from later in the comics, Clark decides he needs to forgo all of his human side and fully embrace his Kryptonian heritage. So he claims, quote unquote, Clark Kent is dead. And that's when you see him donning the black Matrix style long coat and the black t-shirt with the Superman logo on it. That's a cool homage to me of when Superman dies in the comics and comes back and he's got the black suit. I think it's clever that he says, quote unquote, Clark Kent is dead. So the death of Superman causes him to wear the black, and he's trying to turn away from his human side. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I think that might have been a deliberate choice, and I think it was a cool touch nonetheless. I got a lot of moments from season 10 just because It's when they fully ramp it into overdrive of, oh yeah, he should be Superman at some point. When he decides, you know what, if I'm gonna, as a journalist, be writing a lot of stories about Superman, people should be looking up there in the sky at Superman and not looking down here at me. So he realizes he needs to hunch more. He needs to wear the nerdy glasses. And seeing him be the bumbling, moronic Clark as an act, one of my favorite things of all time, because up until this point, you just see the handsome, buff Tom Welling, confident and assured, going, how are you going to pull off the bumbling goof? He pulls off the bumbling goof just fine, and I was happy to see it. You get in season 2, you get him leaping a tall building in a single bound, which I'm like, that's fun. We're still a long way off in terms of the Superman journey, but just laying the little seeds at first is a great moment. Because I appreciate good camera work, I love after Lionel Luthor's funeral, you get this great face-off between Lex and Clark that just kind of sums up their entire relationship of, you get Lex at the top of the hill and Clark at the bottom of the hill, and they just have this stare down of what their relationship used to be and where it can never be ever again. And it just, a picture is worth 1,000 words in that shot, and I think, it's incredibly well done. A moment that will always get to me of just like, they did the thing! It is in the beginning of season 10 when Lois is afraid of a full-term commitment with Clark, so she runs off and starts hanging out with Carter Hall, also known as Hawkman, who's lived thousands of lives. And so she's telling him about like, Clark will always like look out for the whatever, to which Carter Hall calls him the Ubermensch.
To him, the true hero was the person who embraced the life that he or she was given and made it better. He called that person Ubermensch.
A Superman.
She realizes like that's gotta be the name going forward. I'm going, you used Nietzsche, because that's actually where the Superman thing comes from, and you really actually delve into this thing. You use this Ubermensch. It's a little detail, but I'm weird. I know. I fully embrace that. I will lose my stuff every time they do that scene of just going, Superman. The name has power, people. The name has power. Also, another detail that they just kind of glossed over, but I don't care. It's one of my favorite little details about Superman. It's still one of my biggest pet peeves about Man of Steel, actually. Clark's mom drops off a little package at the Kent farm, and at the end of that episode, we find out it's the classic Superman suit, like the suit he will wear someday. But we find out she made it for him, because that's one of my favorite details about Superman, is that Martha makes the Superman suit. And I still think it's a waste that they didn't do that in Man of Steel. I understand what Zack Snyder's going for. I get it. Don't come after me. I just think it misses the point in the relationship between those two characters. And so I think it's funny that they show the Superman suit in the first episode of season 10, and then they lock it behind a paywall for the rest of the season. They're like, nah, you got 21 more episodes before you can see this thing in action. And then honestly, my favorite moment in the entire show, yes, I know you got the moment of like Clark running towards the camera and opening his chest with a big old S on it in the finale, but I knew that was coming. I knew that was happening. I had known for years, even before I started watching the show, the series ends with him running to the camera in the Superman suit. I gave Tom Welling quite a bit of crap, especially in the early seasons, for not wanting to embrace the comic book stuff. It's always well known that he had the no flights, no tights contract in his clause of just like, I don't really feel like wearing a Superman costume or flying in the show, to which I'm going, why are you doing a Superman show? But we get to the tail end of the season, and we get to the episode called Booster, which Tom Welling directs as well as starring in. And we get this moment of the Blue Beetle suit is going haywire, and Booster Gold is too chicken to do anything about it. And so Clark sees everyone fleeing, and he looks to his left, and I still get super excited, and he sees a phone booth, and I'm going, they're not going to. Because leading up to the show, they'd use the phone booth in a clever way of Lois doesn't know who Superman is. She just knows him as the Blur. And so she'd call him in the phone booth, and then he'd answer with his like special phone or whatever. So there's like this more romantic history with the phone booth as opposed to the classic changing in the phone booth. So he turns and looks at the phone booth, and the music starts like ramping up. I'm going, no, they're not going to, are they? No. And so they start doing like the Wonder Woman twist of showing like the camera twirling, and while he doesn't go in like the cape and the the tights and everything, he goes into a superhero costume for season 10 and comes out Superman going, the fact that it was a surprise and the fact that it came from Tom Welling, a man who seemed reluctant to show the comic book side of it, was the one that directed an episode with Blue Beetle, Booster Gold, and a phone booth wardrobe change, I was just really, really happy with, primarily because of the shock value of going, you're actually doing the phone booth change with the epic music and everything else. This makes me happier than the finale, just because the finale was satisfying, but you know it's coming. The fact that I didn't see the phone booth thing coming just made me so happy. But that's kind of my general thoughts on Smallville. I think by and large, really good show, albeit a little inconsistent, that I think had it come out nowadays would have leaned a little bit more into the comic book world. And yeah, I think superhero movies and TV, I think, owe a lot to Smallville because it was that first toe in the water. Yeah, you had Bryan Singer's X-Men, but I think Smallville really kind of got people acclimated of going, okay, we can tell good superhero stories again. You just gotta kind of put up with some weird ones every once in a while. But then again, isn't that comic books in general? You've got good stories and you've got less than stellar ones. What do you guys think? Are you Smallville fans? Have you never checked out the show? Have I inspired you to check out the show? That'd be cool. If not, just let me know your thoughts on Smallville in general. Always like hearing from you guys. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, and then also subscribe to Uncharted Media Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcast. And again, subscribe to us on YouTube. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, and you can help us get there. And as always, stay sharp, movie guys and gals.